What does the Quran actually mean when it says to strike her? So in the ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He talks about reconciliation between a husband and a wife, there are a number of steps that he is to take, right? Wa'idha, right? So that he's supposed to remind her, and then he's supposed to leave the bed, and then He Azza wa Jal says to strike her. And then a lot of people have the question, okay, well, why is this the case? The case is in something that we need to understand, and this is not a way to condone abuse, right? That's not the purpose here, and that's not the idea here. Historically, how people discipline their children and how people discipline their wives have varied from culture to culture and from place to place. And just because we have orders in the Quran, there are a lot of orders that we have in the Quran. So, for example, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would always talk about istinan bisiwak, right? Like using the siwak and using the tooth, like the stick to use to clean our teeth. How many Muslims do that today, right? And the reason I mentioned that is not because we abandon sunan. That's not the idea, and that's not the point. The point I'm trying to make is that in some cultures today, if you go in the Muslim world, people use the siwak, and in other cultures, Muslim also, they don't use the siwak. Is that a problem? I don't think so. And it's the same thing here, right? So striking has different connotations in different cultures. Historically, abuse is not tolerated. I just want to be very clear, right? So there's a difference between abuse and disciplining and striking. The example that many times we use or we speak about, like even in American society, when we talk about hitting kids, right? When we talk about hitting kids, historically, even here in the United States, it was not strange to discipline and to spank, right? Like so, but the term that was used was spank. It wasn't strange to spank children, right? That's not considered something that was strange at all, not that long ago. So even if you go back like 70s, 80s, I grew up in the 90s. It was like I remember I got into a fight with this kid. He threw a rock at me, and like I got cut here, and I had to go get stitches. His father took him outside and had a belt, and he was like hitting him in front of everyone in the neighborhood. This was a white family. He was hitting him in the neighborhood to show that what he did was unacceptable, and I'm disciplining him. Nobody called the police and said, "Oh, there's abuse case, and look at what's going on." This wasn't that long ago, right? You're talking about like 20, 30 years ago, and how cultures change and their attitude towards striking and hitting changes. So, and there are some places where it's tolerated, some places it's not. And even if a husband does strike his wife, at that point, the wife can make a decision, right? She can decide, right? Was this acceptable or was it not? That's her choice. And if she thinks that no, this is abuse, sometimes it's in response to something. I've had a handful of cases, and I've dealt with a number of abuse cases, unfortunately. But some of those cases, I had a couple come in, and the couple was sitting with me, and she was like, "Oh, he's abusive and he does this and blah blah blah." I said, "Okay, well, why didn't you call the police, right? If he's abusing you, you have every right to call the police, because this is not you can't tolerate this, right? You cannot tolerate someone abusing you. There's a zero tolerance policy, even Islamically, for abuse." And she was like, "Oh, well, I did call the police." And I said, "What happened?" She was like, "Oh, well, the police said nothing happened." So I said, "Okay, well, what do you want me to say?" If the police, they came in and they investigated, that means that they didn't see any bruises, they didn't see any marks, you didn't have any video evidence to show that he abused you. And I was like, "I think the opposite is happening. I think he's being abused." And she was like, "How can you say that?" I said, "Miskeen, he was hiding his sleeves, he was hiding his hands, and his hands were full of scratches. Like I could see the marks." Because he was sitting there, he was going like this, and I just glanced over, while she was speaking, I just glanced over and I looked, and I saw the marks on his hands. And I was like, that's why the police didn't take him, because they saw that he was being abused. So does abuse happen both ways? Yes, it does. And this is just one case. The second case I had a couple come in, and she was like, "Oh, he's abusive and this and that, blah, blah, blah." I said, "Okay, well, can you tell me what happened?" She was like, "Yeah, we were in the car, and then he started abusing me." I was like, "So while he was driving, he turned and he started hitting you?" And she was like, "Yeah." I said, "Okay." So I asked her husband, I said, "Well, why did you hit her? Like, why were you hitting her while you were driving? He was like, I was trying to push her off me because she kept scratching me and I felt like I was going to get into an accident. So I said, is that true? Like you were hitting him? She was like, yeah, he was being mean. You know, he was saying he was saying things that were bothering me and that were, and I'm not sharing these stories because again, I'm not justifying abuse, right? That's not the purpose and that of this entire conversation. Any type of abuse needs to be called out immediately, whether it be from the husband or whether it be from the wife. This is not something that is tolerated. This is not a way we express our relationship with our husbands and wives. If I don't like something my wife is doing, what can I do? I tell her. If my wife doesn't like something that I'm doing, she's supposed to tell me. That's how a relationship works. And this is how we draw boundaries. We don't draw boundaries by hitting. We don't draw boundaries by abusing. But if a man is defending himself, he has every right to defend himself. If a wife is hitting her husband, he's allowed to hit her back to stop her. Because ultimately, a man physically is going to be stronger than a woman, right? That's just how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made us. So this idea of striking, this idea of disciplining, this is something even here in American culture. Like, so if you talk like 50s and 60s, they talk about how to keep your wife in check, right? How to control your wife. And one of them was this. And is there a line between discipline, spanking, abuse? Yes, there is. Who decides that? The woman can decide that if she's the one who's being abused. The man can decide that if he's the one who's being abused. And how do you decide that? Call the police. Call the police. And for those sisters who have been in abusive relationships, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to protect all our brothers and sisters. I mean, many times they'll be like, oh, I don't want to break the family. He broke the family the moment he punched you. That wasn't a decision that you made. Or she broke the family the moment she picked up something and she hit you with it. That's not your decision. That was the decision the other person made. So please put these things in perspective. I don't stand for abuse. Nobody should stand for abuse. But it's also important to understand these ayat were put in a context that is very clear. There was a study that was done, I forgot in which African country, but I think it was Nigeria, I'm not sure. But the question is, do you tolerate your husband hitting you, right? Do you have a tolerance for your husband hitting you? And I think it was like, they asked a bunch of women, right? Do you tolerate it? And it was, I think it was like 70% of Christian women, they said yes. And it was like 60% of Muslim women said yes. And again, Islam came for all places and all religions. I don't know what is tolerated and what happens in that culture, right? Like, I don't know, because every culture is different. But the one thing, even historically, that Muslims cannot and should not tolerate is abuse. Right? If someone is hitting their spouse because they want to defend themselves or they want to stop them from something, it's also important to understand, like, abuse is usually not a one-time incident, right? It's not a one-time incident. If somebody is abusive, like if a man is abusive toward his wife, that person is an animal, right? And he's not going to do it one time. Anytime he sees something that he doesn't like, he's just going to do that. But if you have one instance, or you have two instances, for example, then it's important to look at those instances and say, okay, well, what is going on here? What's happening here, right? It deserves an investigation. We're very quick to write off people. We're very quick to not forgive. But if there's a pattern, call the police. I'm saying, like, even the first time, you have every right. Please, don't misunderstand me. If anyone is being abused, call the police. Don't waste any time. This is not to be tolerated. This is not something, and so, oh, well, I have a family, I have this, blah, blah, blah. So we want to teach our children that it's okay for a husband to punch his wife? We want to teach our children that it's okay for a wife to take a weapon against her husband? Is this the kind of family we want to raise? And my children, if they're seeing this, what are they going to think about marriage? Right? If they see an abusive parents, they say, oh, he hits him. Are they going to want to get married when they get older? If they see, like, oh, this is marriage, is this what they're going to want to get married? Is that going to encourage them? Anyway, we really need to learn how to draw lines, and we really need to learn how to deal with each other. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us tawfiq.